By the 1920s, gray wolves were completely wiped out of Yellowstone National Park. The last known wolf pack there was killed around 1926 under a deliberate federal predator control policy. Then in January 1995, wildlife officials released 14 wolves captured in Alberta, Canada, straight into a valley that had been dead of wolves for almost 70 years. The wolves arrived in wooden crates and were released directly into the park after years of legal and political battle. What happened to the rivers after that release is one of the most debated stories in modern ecology. By the end of this video, you'll understand both the viral version of this story and the science that actually disputes it. The reintroduction wasn't simple or popular from the start. Ranchers and political figures in Wyoming and Montana fought it hard, calling it a direct threat to livestock and grazing land. A federal judge even ordered the wolves removed in late 1997 after a lawsuit from the American Farm Bureau Federation. That removal order was stayed and later overturned on appeal, which is the only reason the wolves were allowed to stay in the park at all. A second release followed in early 1996, bringing the total number of reintroduced wolves to roughly 31 across those first 2 winters. Wildlife officials chose Alberta wolves specifically because they were used to hunting elk in terrain similar to Yellowstone's own mountains and valleys. Here's where the story most people already know actually begins, and it starts with elk, not rivers. Ecologists William Ripple and Robert Bishta at Oregon State University studied Yellowstone from roughly 2003 to 2012. Their most complete findings were published in a 2012 paper in the journal Biological Conservation. Their argument was that wolves didn't just reduce elk numbers, they changed how elk behaved across the entire park. Elk started avoiding exposed riverside corridors, the exact spots where they were most vulnerable to a wolf ambush. Ecologists call this a landscape of fear, a shift in elk movement driven by the risk of being hunted, not just the raw number of wolves actually hunting. With elk pulling back from the riverbanks, willow and aspen saplings that had been chewed down for decades finally started regrowing. That regrowth stabilized the riverbanks, and stabilized banks set off the next stage of the story. Stronger root systems along the banks also meant less soil erosion during spring snowmelt, when river flow is at its heaviest. Beavers, which need willow to build their dams, started returning to parts of the park where they'd been completely absent. Beaver dams then reshaped stream hydrology in some areas, changing the actual pattern of the channels themselves. This chain reaction became known as a trophic cascade, one species change rippling all the way down to reshape the physical landscape. It went viral worldwide through a short film called How Wolves Change Rivers, narrated by George Monbiot. That film alone has been viewed tens of millions of times online, and it's where most people first heard this exact story. It's also almost always where the story stops. But here's the part that version never mentions. This entire chain of events is genuinely disputed among working ecologists. Wolf biologist L. David Metch has pushed back hard on how strong this cascade really was. Researchers at Colorado State and Utah State universities have joined that pushback with their own field data. A competing study found that roughly 60% of sampled aspen stands showed no recovery at all. That single number directly contradicts the idea of a clean, park-wide aspen comeback. Critics argue the landscape of fear effect has been overstated in the popular version of this story. Elk avoided riverbanks for more reasons than wolves alone, according to this research. Reduced elk hunting outside the park boundaries likely let more elk survive overall, changing herd size and behavior on its own. The recovery of cougar and bear populations added extra predation pressure that had nothing to do with wolves specifically. Cougar populations in particular had been rebuilding in the region for years before the 1995 wolf release even happened. Even water table changes and shifting precipitation patterns may have driven just as much vegetation recovery as any predator ever did. This debate isn't settled history from the 2000s either. It's still actively running right now. A Colorado State University study in 2024 reopened the argument in detail. Ripple's group and other researchers were still publishing corrections and replies back and forth as recently as 2026. So which version is actually true, the viral one or the disputed one? The honest answer is both, just in very different proportions. Wolves reintroduced in 1995 genuinely did reduce elk numbers across the park. They also genuinely changed some elk behavior near exposed river corridors. Willow and aspen recovery is real in many parts of Yellowstone, That part of the story checks out. Beavers really have returned to areas of the park they'd abandoned for decades before 1995. What's overstated is the idea that wolves alone caused a clean, park-wide transformation of the entire river system. Ripple and Bestad's original papers described a fairly uniform recovery across Yellowstone's northern range. The real picture is patchy recovery, not a single dramatic before and after. It's driven by wolves combined with hunting changes, other predators, and shifting water conditions, all acting at the same time. That's a far less dramatic story than the viral video version most people have already seen. But it's the one actual field data from 2024 and 2026 continues to support. 14 wolves in wooden crates, released into a valley that hadn't held a wolf in almost 70 years, still triggered one of the most studied ecological experiments on the planet. Just not in the simple, single-cause way most people online still believe today. The 60% figure from that competing aspen study alone should have changed how this story gets told. Instead, the simpler version, wolves saved the rivers, kept spreading because it's the version with the viral film behind it. There's one detail from this story we haven't gotten into yet: why a single 1997 court order almost sent every one of these wolves right back to Canada. If you want to see how that legal fight actually played out, that full story is waiting for you in the next video on this channel.